Well, I hope everything is working now. I am recording. It looked like I pushed to record. So, and what that is it goes on to the North Dakota post adopt website afterwards. And I talked about the title, Telling the Truth to Your Adopted or Foster Child. It was from a book by Betsy Kiefer Smalley and Jane Schuler. And then a little bit about myself. My name is Kim Waswick, and I was born and raised in good old Minot, North Dakota. I graduated from Minot State University with my social work degree. And after I graduated from college, I moved to Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1998 with my husband, Ron, and my son, Aaron. And my son Aaron is now married now and lives in Minneapolis with his beautiful bride, Brittany. And then after Aaron and Brittany got married in 2018, Ron and I moved back to Minot. We wanted to be closer to family and stuff like that. And when I moved back to Minot, I worked in the medical field for a little while in hospice at the hospital. But I was really blessed to get this job in October of this year with Catholic Charities. So this is what I have been doing ever since. So we'll go to the next slide. And I was presented with an opportunity to create a webinar. And with the knowledge that I had about adoption and all the information out there, I'm pretty familiar with adoption. I do have personal experiences with my own family. I have an older sister that was placed for adoption when she was 4 years old. And I do have two nephews that my sister had placed for adoption at birth. And my mom has always been pretty open and honest about having another sibling, that we had another sibling. And she just made the best adoption plan for our family under the circumstances at the time. There was some abuse going on and stuff like that. So, however, I am fairly new to working in the adoption field. And so I began looking and searching out there as to what was out there for knowledge and adoption information. And there are all kinds of books out there, and you even put anything in on the computer and into the search area or anything on your phone, and there's just a wealth of information out there on articles and blogs and stuff like that. I chose to focus on a book that I borrowed from a coworker, and that book is called Telling the Truth to Your Adopted or Foster Child. And maybe one or all of you are familiar with that, because I know that is a book that is presented to people that are in foster care, guardianship, and adoption by some of the ASK workers. So this is a pretty common book. But what I'm going to focus on is the principles. But within the book, the first chapter, they talk about the power of secrets on family relations. And this chapter is about how it affects the families. And some people keep secrets from their children and from their family just because they feel shame, or they just want to forget that it happened. That's why some people have kept secrets about that. The second chapter is The Truth or Consequences, a Great Debate. This one talks about the myth versus reality, and it's stories about the consequences of not being honest with the adopted child or with your family about it. The third chapter is Just the Facts, Ma'am, and that one is about why it's so important to tell the child the truth. Is one of the things that the child could do is take on that fantasy world of when they are adopted. If they don't know what the truth is, maybe they make up a story in their mind that, maybe my dad is David Hasselhoff, and he's going to come in a limo and take me away. So if you don't tell them that truth, then they're gonna live in that fantasy world. And the chapter 4 is Learning About Your Child, a fact-finding mission. This was a fun chapter, and it was essentially the olden days with fact-finding versus the new age, which we know it's just gone crazy with technology and stuff like that over the years. And back in the old days, when someone had adopted a child, you may have been just presented with it was the mom's name and maybe just one or two other facts. And now these days, you can actually use the safe haven, which is leaving the child at a safe house, safe place. And sometimes it's like the local firehouse and stuff like that. They call that safe haven. And sometimes you had no facts at all receiving that child for adoption. And nowadays, a lot of times with adoption, we receive a lot of our information from the case managers, people that we're working with to get to that adoption journey. And so we can use other avenues like the media, Facebook, Ancestry.com. I actually haven't done that yet, but I heard that's a pretty amazing outlet for fact finding. And the 5th chapter, Adoption Through a Child's Eyes, that's the developmental stages from birth to late adolescence. And they use the technical age of 19 as the furthest of late adolescence to keep communicating with that child. And that's what chapter 6 is about, is the continuation of ongoing communication through a parent's eyes, the challenges in creating the environment. Chapter 7, which is the principles, which we're going to talk about. And chapter 8, sharing the hard stuff. That's always one of those that the parents want to know, how do I do this? And so that was one of the ones that we'll talk about with the principles also. But sharing the hard stuff, there's examples about if that child comes with trauma and history of, say, abuse, which is, sexual, physical neglect and things like that. That one's a tough one to talk about with the child. Chapter 9, 12 tools of parent-child communication. And maybe you are familiar with that also, going on this adoption journey. Maybe at one time someone suggested to do what they call a life book, which is where you start from the beginning and this is how you came into my life and stuff like that. There's family trees, collages, memory boxes, and things like that you can explain and talk to the child. Chapter 10, transracial and transcultural adoption. And this is the history of the international placement and racial identity and things like that. They talk about that in that chapter. Chapter 11, kinship. This could be a whole webinar in itself because it happens so often with grandparents becoming that parent to that child. Maybe it's an aunt or an uncle, but they try and keep the adoption journey within the triad, within a family. And so that's first things first, that's what they try and do. So that does happen a lot. And chapter 12, adolescence, keeping the lines of communication open. This is this was a longer chapter. This was adolescence and talking about the adolescent brain. I don't know if you have personal experience with children and adolescents and stuff like that, but they're a different little creature sometimes. But they talk about the adolescent brain and being a teenager and communicating with them. And then chapter 13, managing communication with openness in adoption. And that's about specific questions and maybe scenarios on how to answer them communication wise. And then the last chapter 14, it talks about healthy communication and talking to when they talk about outside of the family, it's going to be like family and friends and neighbors and things like that. And there's so much information in that whole book, and each chapter has great stories. And it's actually a pretty easy read because some books are like way above and you're not really understanding. I thought it was a really great book and easy to follow and stuff like that. We're just going to focus on the principles, which is chapter 7. And when I am doing the webinar and I'm creating and thinking, if I was on the other side receiving the information, first things first, I wanted to know what exactly is a principle. And so when you put that in the search, there are lots of different definitions that come up. And when you look at the different definitions, 1, 2, 3, and 4, they seem kind of way over my head when it comes to the definitions. But when I look at each one and I pull out words that are similar, I think that all of them have actually a lot in common. Things like foundation, belief, morally correct, and a source. So essentially what a principle is it's just a guide. It's there are a few rules that are written in stone. A lot of them, whether it's Drive 55 or something like that, there are things that are written in stone. But a lot of rules, there are some negotiation, but the principles of truth telling, these are just guidelines and they're starters, ideas on how to start a conversation and keep it going with your family and that adopted child. So when following the principles, it'll enhance and aid in the communication that you have with others. So then the first chapter, just to kind of start out with and put it into a nutshell as to what the principles are all about. It talks about the parents. First of all, it's tough knowing that you need to tell the child the whole truth. And so the questions, some of the common questions are, Do I really have to tell the whole truth? And how old should my child be, when I start truth telling with them? And one of the things that I talked about at the beginning to start it out was parents believe that they should wait, and that we talk about in Principle 5. And they want to protect the child, and sometimes they're waiting for the child to ask questions before they talk to them. And communication wise, when I talk about communication throughout the webinar, there are different communication styles for everybody, and that could be a whole webinar in itself with how I present the information and how the person on the other side accepts the information. And there's some things in here, the little puzzles about physical abilities that would be of the child, age of the child receiving, and skills both of the child receiving and of the person giving. And there's some other examples in there that'll make a difference on the communication styles on both receiving and giving. So what I thought that I also, like on the receiving end of watching a webinar on talking truth, I thought that was the cutest little picture there, that cute little baby. Adoption history. I want to know too, how did this all come about with adoption? And then when I looked at the history of adoption, to see how far we have come over the years. I mean, of course, everything's exploded the last 100 years, but in adoption, the first modern adoption legislation was called Adoption of Children Act. This was passed in Massachusetts in 1851, and it required a judge to determine that adoptive parents had sufficient ability to bring up the child. So this is where they enacted that law, and where they had a little more control over adoption in the process. And in the 19th century, people, they wanted to avoid being labeled as having an illegitimate child, because that was taboo, and you really didn't talk about that. So often a pregnant mom would be sent away to, quote unquote, live with relatives or go to school for a few months. And what was happening was they were hiding that child being born. And the records were sealed, and they were sealed for eternity. So they were just never opened, and nobody had any rights to those records back then. And imagine how many people never even knew that they were adopted, because it was just a hush hush. And with the adoption laws and the languages changing and evolving over the years, in the 1950s and the 1970s, it was still kind of a touchy subject. And the medical and family histories, they were sealed for the most part. And then in 1979, Marietta Spencer had come up with the positive adoption language, and it was she was a fun fact, because I'm a social worker. Marietta Spencer, she was a social worker that lived in the Minneapolis area, and she created this positive adoption language. It was crafted to convey the respect, dignity, and responsibility, and that had everything to do with the decision that was made both by the parent and the birth parent about adoption. So it was just forming that responsibility and taking ownership. So now what? Getting back to the principles. How do I start the conversation with the child? The principles within, we're going to talk about each principle, but they talk about adoption, and it's essentially, like I said, is it's a guide to parents and stuff like that. But a deciding factor on when you talk to your child also depends upon thinking about what kind of adoption do you have or do you plan to have. Is it a family adoption? It's going to be different on how you talk to that child and other family members. Is it, the grandmother, aunt, and things like that? Was this child adopted at birth and they don't know any other way except for being with your family and being your child? Or was the child in foster care for a little bit prior to adoption? That, how you start that conversation and how that conversation goes is that's going to depend upon some of those factors. And then remember, I have my little note to say that reminder-wise, and I know I'm going to say it again, and hopefully you'll understand that it's going to be a common concept, is there's no cookie-cut answer to what you say and how you say it. The principles are just guidelines for you to start thinking of those things. And as a parent, I know you and I can guarantee you, you will know when the time is right as a parent to go ahead and talk to that child. And I'll talk to you about some of the cues that may be happening that you're like, okay, maybe this is the time. So, and the main goal of telling your child about his or her adoption, after all, is just for them to be comfortable in their own skin and to understand that this is normal. And I'm in a normal family, and this happens, and this is normal. So initiating the conversation. I practiced this one time yesterday, and I was told that this video does not play. So I'm not even going to play it because then I'll probably end up messing things up. But it was only a couple-minute video by Dr. Brudzinski. He's a psychologist and author. I just thought it was neat to hear from him what he thought about adoption and when to say it. And I'll make some references to him. But when you're looking for opportunities to initiate conversation about adoption and initiate talking to your child and looking for what am I looking for? A segue to start the conversation. Maybe when that child starts saying, mommy, daddy, where do babies come from? That might be a good time to go, all right, let's sit down and we'll talk about this from A to B. Maybe they'll ask about Easter Bunny, if that's real, or the Santa Claus and stuff like that. That'll be a good time, and you'll see that might be the maturity part that, okay, it's time that we talk. Another technique that they talk about in the book is called storytelling. And that technique, they use the terms once upon a time. So when you sit down to talk with your son, daughter, about adoption and how they became part of your family, it could be as cute as once upon a time there was a little boy that came in a spaceship, or however you want to say that to the child, depending upon how old they are. And when I was looking for information, I thought it was a really cute story, but a parent wrote, 4 years ago, we met our then 5-week-old son at the airport with his birth mother and instantly fell in love with him. Our then 2.5-year-old daughter, who was also adopted, thought for the longest time that he came from the airport. The kids are now 6 and 4, and their birth families are welcome in our lives. Just more people to love and forever grateful and whatever they give to us. So that would have been a cute way to explain to the little boy that your older sister thought you came from the airport. So if you have a cute story that you can start by telling them, that's what the storytelling is. And then the next introduction to adoption, the technique that they used, books. So you on your adoption journey, and knowing that this is a journey that you were going to take with this child, I'm sure you have a wealth of little kid books and stuff like that in your library. And then knowing that you're going to have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or even a teenager coming into your life as a new family member, you probably have some other books already for them to educate themselves and stuff like that. So books, having it in their library and stuff like that. The photo book, this is where they talk about the life book and the mementos. I know that working with the Ask workers, which are the ones that help you through that journey, a lot of times they will help you through starting one of those life books and keeping those mementos of how they came into your life. Say there's a program or a movie that you have watched, that could be a segue. When I say program, the first thing that comes to mind, I have never watched it, but some of my coworkers here talk about The Fosters, and that's a movie I've never seen it, but I was told that it's more for teenage, adult brain, teenage kind of thing, because it can be kind of adult in situation, but that's the one that's on Hulu and Amazon or something like that. I don't have either of those. So, and when it comes to little kids, maybe a segue could be one of the kids' movies of Lilo and Stitch, which I have to admit I haven't seen that one, but Despicable Me, love that show. Kung Fu Panda, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I forget about them, that they're adopted. And then Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, he's adopted. So that's one of those things that you could watch and then just talk about their life and how different it is from their movie-wise. Another thing that they talked about was the times of the year. So the timing is right. You feel it's time to visit with that child about adoption, talk more about it, and it's Mother's Day is coming up. It could be a good segue to talk about today is Mother's Day and this is how I became a mother, or today is Father's Day and this is how we became parents. So that could be a segue. Commenting on a positive characteristic or on a child's accomplishments. So they are doing the greatest artwork, and their artwork is always great. You put them up on the fridge. And you could just say what a great painter that you are, and your birth father was an artist, so there could be a segue to connect common characteristics and stuff like that. Could be a segue. Seeking out other adoptive parents and their stories, and that's where you have your own little connection of people, just knowing that they have also adopted, so you have a connection there, and friends and family and stuff like that. You know, how did you start out the conversation if you're having a tough time starting that conversation? Just having that that network of people. Our next principle is use of positive language. This is what I had talked about with Marietta, the social worker from Minneapolis, the positive language, which is actually very new. So it takes a lot of practice. Even me, not having a background in working with people, but having adoption knowledge, it's taken me a little bit to learn that language. I'm going to take a drink of water. Okay, and when it talks about talking about adoption, I'm not only using talking to the child, but you're going to do a lot of explaining to other families and friends and stuff like that have their own idea, and you're going to do a lot of education for them. So when you talk about adoption, using that positive language, and the little negative that I have on there is back in the old days, and they would say that, the natural parent or the adoptive parent, they now code that as the birth parent and the birth mother, the birth father, taking ownership to that. And then really when it comes down to it, you are not the adoptive parent, you are the parent, and you are the dad, and this is my child. Taking that ownership and just dropping the adjective altogether, plain and simple, you are their parent. So using that positive language, and it takes a lot of practice, because like I said, it is a pretty new concept when you think about it. That was only 70 years ago, so that really wasn't that long ago. In a nutshell, parents are seeking to banish that negative attitude and connotation when it comes to their child being adoption or choosing adoption as a plan. So then when it comes down to it, we'll talk about it, the adoptee also doesn't want that negative aspect of their adoption glossed over. So that is real to them. It's real to you as a family. So it should all be normalized and stuff like that. So, I wrote something on the bottom here to remember to say it. When it comes down to it, terms are is finding the terms that are more appealing and less offensive to yourself and others. So we live in a world of people taking these literally and stuff like that. So it's just finding the right words, and these are the right words. And when it comes to truth telling, the information that I have read and talking to my coworkers, if I've heard once, I've heard many times about never lying to a child about their past or their birth family and stuff like that, because it's you're going to find the best way to be open and honest from day one, and you're going to find creative ways to talk about that with your family and with that child and stuff like that. Like in the previous slides, adoptees don't want any negative aspect of their adoption glossed over. Being honest about the information that you know, the child always deserves to know the truth. The scenario that I have two scenarios, and one is, let's say that the child has come from a foster family, or they lived with their birth family for a while, so they have memories of being adopted, and they've developed a bond with that family, with that birth family, and the child may never ask about adoption or how I became part of this family, because they don't want to feel like they're being disloyal to anybody. So the child may never ask. So it's finding the right time to talk to that child about it. And there are some of the other negative things that might happen is it's a really technical world out there, and the child may search on their own or accidentally find out from a sibling or a relative that there are ways that that child finds out about it. You want to have that opportunity to tell them first so that you still have that trust and that bond with that child. And otherwise there are going to be trust issues. But one of the stories that I found when I was doing my research was the story is titled, How I Learned I Was Adopted. My sophomore biology class was studying genetics when I learned by accident that I was adopted. As my teacher used eye color as an example of recessive genes, she explained that two blue-eyed parents would never have a brown-eyed child. It was genetically impossible, she said. I raised my hand, happy to be the exception, and I said, my parents have blue eyes and mine are brown, I told the class. The teacher looked a little confused, but figured maybe one of my parents didn't have true blue eyes before changing the subject, so that was a little awkward. But, how did that child, I mean, they're still a child, they're a sophomore, but they're still young and learning, and going home to explain to their parents, found something out in school and I think we need to talk. I mean, there's going to be some trust issues there. So that parent should have told that child a long time ago. So, and then the flip side of not being honest with the child and the trust issues and stuff like that, they could be very angry at you for a long time. And so, like I said, having that conversation with them, the sooner the better. The next principle is when that child first learns about adoption, and hopefully with the transition of, if you've had that transition of younger and slowly using that adoption language from day one, a lot of times this might pertain to a child who is older that finds out about adoption and past history. And if the child is angry when they know some or all of the story, they might be confused, and they might have some questions, or they might just yell, it just doesn't make any sense, I don't get it. So depending upon the age, and we'll talk about age appropriate here on the next slide, they may feel hurt, feel rejected, sad, or alone. And just putting myself into that child's shoes, I think I would feel alone or rejected. From a parent perspective, listening, keeping your ears open, shaking your head, acknowledging, and just saying that you're glad that they're safe now. And we'll talk into another slide about the negative training. So when the child is old enough to have memories of their birth parents, positive or negative, it's still their memories. And don't indulge in the negative talk about birth parents. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. We don't want to say, yeah, they're bad people, all right. You just, it's finding that neutral and that happy medium. We'll talk about that. And it is difficult, I know. It's hard for, it's easy for me to say, this is what you need to do. I'm a parent also, but I want to protect my Aaron. I want to protect, as a parent, that's normal and that's natural to protect them. But the reactions that child is having when they find out and they learn new information, that's normal. And they're going to go through that. And it's just giving them that space to experience all those feelings without judgment. The next principle is sharing information in a developmentally appropriate way. In that video with Dr. Brodzinski, he suggested between the ages of 2 and 4, introducing the word adoption and through conversation and stuff like that. But the ideal time, when they take surveys and use statistics, 97% know about their adoption story by the age of 5. So ideal wise, they say between 6 and 8. And there are going to be different levels of maturity, delay in learning, things like that with each child, and he'll know when it's time. And then that was the other thing within Dr. Brodzinski's video, he talks about normalizing, which I kind of touched on. And there are so many different families out there. There's families with one child, there's families with 10 children. And so there are different kinds of families and different ways of growing up. And if that child is a different race, when you have adopted, you're going to want to tell them as soon as possible. And I'm sure you understand the reasons why they're just telling them sooner, because they're gonna figure it out that something's different here, something's not right. And then just using the simple short communication and stuff like that. So when it talks about some are open to talking about their feelings and stuff, like some think it's no big deal. Quick story. My son, Aaron, he was a 1.5 years old when my husband, Ron, and I had met, and we became a family. And he was about 6-ish. I don't even remember how old he was, but he was just a little shyster. He was about 6, and we sat him down because he was asking about Santa Claus and if Santa Claus was real. I think he heard something at school or something. I'm like, okay, there's my segue. And so we sat down, Ron and I, and we were talking. I did most of the talking. I talked about marriage and two people loving each other and getting married and having a family and a child, and you were that child. And I talked about some people don't get along and they realize that they're not good for each other. So I talked about getting a divorce, and then your biological father, Bill, and this is your dad, Ron, and stuff like that. So I tried to explain everything in a nice way, and he listened and he shook his head and he was listening and stuff like that. And so I said, at the end, I said, do you have any questions? He said, can I have a snack? So he didn't care one way or the other. He had such a great relationship with Ron that was his dad, and he knew no other way. So that he was okay with that. And omissions, and meaning what you don't tell them. Omissions are okay until the age of 12. But by adolescence, all information about their adoption and their history should be shared with them. And the complicated history, it may be too adult as a child. So that's where you're talking about other things to a 6-year-old and things like that. But the hard stuff, that should be, we'll talk about it another slide about how do you tell the child that tough information. When I say adult, some of the hard to explain things are that I was reading that I'm like, oh, that would be tough, is, what if the birth mother was a prostitute and they used drugs? So that would be hard to explain to a 6 and a 7-year-old. And that's where you would put in there that, your birth mother chose adoption because she wanted you to be raised by a 2-person family. So, it's explaining to the child that they're adopted. And it's putting a little bit of a sugar coating on it. But eventually you're going to tell them the real reason why that they were given up for adoption. So as teens, they talk about mission until the age of 12, because when they become teenagers, it's going to get really rough trying to be honest with them and tell them the truth. So the sooner you tell them, the sooner they can absorb it and deal with those emotions. I thought it was a really, kind of comical, it kind of made me giggle insert on the book, and I'm going to read it to you. Teens are because they're reevaluating who they are. They're trying to fit in. They're changing their hair color, and they're letting it grow. And my son had an idea that he wanted to let his hair grow, and I'm like, you look like a girl. So you just let them deal with that stuff. But the definition in here of adolescence is, they had put, it's a part of the job description of an adolescent to challenge whatever messages come from adults, particularly from their own parents. Therefore, adoptive parents are advised to share information before their child enters the argumentative, stormy stage of adolescence. Children of 11 or 12 will understand and accept information that an older adult or an older youth might not accept. So when you tell them at 10, 11, and 12, it's going to be a little bit easier to take it than the I am not listening to you right now stage. And when you're talking about adoption to a child, depending upon what kind of memories that they have and stuff like that, and how they became part of your family. You could start it out with, what do you remember about the time you lived with your birth family or foster family, or your relatives, before they became part of your family, and find out what the child thinks, and what do they want to know. That could be a segue to talking with them. And now that you're older, I bet you have questions about your birth family. You could present it as that, and what would you like to talk about? Are you having any grievances or concerns, or are you confused? So asking them instead of telling them. And the 8th principle, and repeat. They're going to have lots of questions. So as a child matures, they're going to develop additional questions because maybe they had a conversation at school with one of their friends. Sometimes I'd love to be a mouse in the corner to hear their little conversations, but it's amazing what they talk about and what they share. So who knows what the child will hear, whether it's from a teacher, from a relative, a friend, maybe something they read or saw online. There's so much information out there. So, and one of the suggestions in the book is that if it's been a while, say they haven't asked any questions for a while, maybe that would be an opportunity for you to bring the conversation up. Just so that they know that you care and you are always thinking about them and you are on this journey with them. So bringing that up. The 9th principle, being realistic when you talk about that information with them, and don't paint a picture that's too overly positive or too overly negative. I like that picture too because I have an orange cat. So if it's too rosy of an explanation of, yeah, your birth mother and father, they were great people and they lived in a big house and stuff like that. If you paint something that's too rosy, then the child might say, well, great. Well, then why didn't I stay in their home? So you don't want something that's too positive or too negative. You want that neutral in between. And the negative part is not joining that negative train of chastising that parent for the decision that they made or what had happened for them to become part of your family, that child. When you talk about the not so great things, like the abuse and the neglect and stuff like that. And, there are involuntary termination of parent rights, which is why that child was available as adoption to your family. There are memories that the child has, both positive and negative, and their characteristics are going to be positive and negative. Not everybody is a bad person. And if they have memories and stuff like that, the negative part is your parents, your birth parents, they didn't feed you and you didn't have very many meals. So that child was was placed for adoption because there was the neglect, which is the no food. But on a positive side, that child remembers that if my mom did have food, which wasn't very often, she gave me the food. So that's their positive memory that they have. So there's both positive and negative about memories. Let's see here, the 10th principle. If information is negative, and I can't imagine, that must be tough, but if information is negative, using a third party might be your best way of talking to that child and being honest about the information that their history, and maybe they already see a therapist because of the trauma that they have in their past related to information telling. So, and be very, 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 very careful about the extreme negative information that you need to share about the birth family or any trauma history. And the examples that I gave, like, maybe there was, incest and things like that. Those are things that you're going to want to seek out the therapist, involve the therapist they already have, or find a therapist. And the book always suggests it, and so do I, as being part of that child's life, that when they do see the therapist, to always be involved. There's going to be different kinds of therapy, one-on-one and family and things like that. But as a parent, you want to be involved in that, whether you're in the room as a therapist is talking about it. And a lot of times as a therapist, they will still have you as a parent tell that information, but they're just to kind of help you through any troubles and fumbling that you have. It all depends on what the information is and who the therapist is. So, and it's also based upon your comfort level on any of the details, because there can be some pretty traumatic details out there. I've read all kinds of things that the history that that child, may come with. The next one is the principle of, don't try and fix the pain of adoption. So with the adoption, they talk about even as a parent having a newborn, there's still trauma that child has had, and maybe they don't have exact memories, but they've still experienced that trauma. And not trying to fix the pain of adoption, but it's natural for parents to want to protect. And being with them on that journey and explaining to them, I know that this hurts, honey, but the only, is the word of advice that they had in the book, which I thought made great sense, which is why I put that on there, is the only way out of that pain of adoption is through. They have to work through that pain, and you are there to help them through that journey, depending upon what kind of trauma that they have. And the recovery is a process that takes time and patience, and remind them that the biggest thing is that I wrote down here is that the trauma is not their fault. As a child, they blame themselves, but just reminding them that you care about them and love them, and it's not their fault. So. And the principle 12, if the child refuses or resists communication, you just have to try again another time. And as they grow more mature, this was in reference to a previous slide that we had on there, they may be confused over any grief or loss, learning about their adoption journey, and they may yell at you and get mad at you because you're the one helping them, that, I don't want to talk about it. Can we just drop it? I can just hear my son saying that. And if there are sensitive issues that you want to talk to them about or bring up to them, some kids are more receptive if you don't make eye contact with them. They use the example in the book about, if you're driving to the grocery store with them and it's just you and your daughter driving to the grocery store, that might be a good way to talk about something while you have them there in the car, and then not making eye contact. I thought of some examples of maybe doing dishes together and talking about that, or cooking something together. You're busy with your hands, so you're not really looking in each other's eyes, but that depends on their maturity and how they absorb things. So, and every parent is different on how they present that. Another thing they talked about in the book is maybe having that child be in a support group, whether it's online or things like that. As a parent, and a parent myself, you're probably going to want to check out that meeting ahead of time, just to make sure it's a safe place for them, that it's going to work for them. And there's nothing wrong with checking that out ahead of time. I think as a parent, I would recommend it. And then again, with the negative train, not imposing value judgment on the information that you hear and you gain. Like I said, some of that information is going to come from that case manager. Prior to some of that information, you might get physically, meaning you might get the court papers. However, you get that information on the history in the past of the trauma that child had. And not, imposing judgment on that person that made that adoption plan. And it might be horrific. I know I've read some of the stuff, but explaining to the teen or the older child that his mother was raped. But with that, you could also explain that your birth mother rejected the rape, not you. So they were a result of the rape. But, explain that it's not their fault. The 14th principle is that The child should have control of telling their story outside of the immediate family. This is when I talk about there are so many people that are going to try and help and ask questions and make comments, whether it's a neighbor, school friends of your child. The history belongs to the child, not to the adoptive parent. And if you prepare that child ahead of time, when relatives bring up questions, acquaintances, you might be at a restaurant or on a playground with your child, and a stranger may approach you, and some of the questions they may ask, which I've actually heard. It was in a booth behind me. A sweet lady asked, are those all your children? So, people mean well. They want to make conversation, but they ask questions that are a little invasive. So it's just having your child practice that and having what they call a short, simple story. They call it a cover story. They've used the Y's, the W, the I, the S, and the E, putting that are having a scenario ready for that child, and explaining you have a choice. Bobby, you can walk away and ignore what is being said, whether it's a friend at school or a kid on the playground. You can walk away. You have that choice. And the I part is that child could reply back to the evasive questions. It's private, or I don't want to talk to you about this, or I don't want to answer. The S part is sharing something about their adoption story. So if it's something that it could be as, if I came from an airport, it could be something cute that that child wants to share with somebody else about their adoption story, that our family is real, and things like that. Just whatever resonates with them in their heart. And then the E part is educate others about adoption. So the child could just make, an education remark about adoption without talking about themselves and sharing a story about themselves. It could be, I really couldn't find too many fun facts about that, but the one that I did find was the child could come back with a smile and say, did you know that adults can be adopted too? So then it's putting it back on the word adoption. And the other thing that I found was, did you know that 794 kids are waiting to be adopted? So that's just too many numbers for me to even say out loud, but it could be as factual as that. So it takes the heat off of them and puts it back on adoption. So with preparing that child for the questions that they're going to have, it's empowering that child to take control of their story and the situation. It's very empowering to have them choose their response. The 15th principle that they talk about, and this is actually the final principle, is remembering that, I know that we talked about this before, and this kind of ends and wraps up, that the child probably already knows more than what you think. If you're not honest with that child, they're going to find out another way. And I have to say, media is just, wow. It's just, even just putting in my first and last name, it's amazing what you can find out there. So it's just a reminder that they know a lot more than, especially for older kids, but myself as a child, I know I like to be around adults, and so I would sneak in and hide under the table. So I would hear things from the other room, and so it's amazing what kids hear, and they're pretty good detectives, and they about finding out facts and stuff like that. So the last one, ooh, look at what I did. I made a little flutter thing. The wrapping up part, having a warm and trusting environment all the time. I know that there's lots of challenges and difficulties and chaos and things happening, and now with COVID and stuff like that, just always having that environment is a trusting environment and atmosphere, so that child always knows that they can come to you at any time with any open communication and just listening to your heart about what to say and when to say it. reminder, I know that people tell you this all the time, and I'm going to tell you again, just finding that support for yourself and taking care of yourself. And the more you talk about it, the more comfortable that you will feel. You're going to make mistakes and you're going to fumble, and just admit them and move on. I found this beautiful quote. Adoption is not a difference or a divide between your family, but rather the action that brought you together as a family. So I thought that was really, really nice. Just be kind to yourself and be patient and stuff like that. So, oh, I am all done, and I'm going to come on out of here. I'm going to put everybody up if you guys have any questions at all. I can certainly try and help you through it. And if I don't know the answer, I will help. I will get that answer, and I will get back with you. If there's anything that you can think of that you want me to try and help you through right now, is there anything that you have any questions about? Nope. Well, if you don't have any questions, I will go ahead and stop I'll stop the recording anyways here.